The afternoon sun filtered through the studio windows of a major British television network as preparations were underway for what should have been an ordinary episode of a popular daytime talk show. The energy in the corridors was typical of any weekday broadcast, producers rushing about with clipboards, makeup artists preparing stations, and crew members doing final sound checks. It was just another Tuesday, or so everyone thought, but this particular Tuesday would become memorable in television history, not for the right reasons, and for events that would be discussed and debated for months to come. An entertainment legend arrived at the studios with the expectation of a pleasant conversation. The 73-year-old performer had been invited to discuss his upcoming tour and his remarkable career spanning several decades. He was a household name, someone who had brought joy to millions of people through music and entertainment. His appearance on the show was meant to be celebratory, a chance to reconnect with fans and talk about his future plans in the industry. The guest arrived with professionalism and warmth, ready to share stories and enthusiasm about the work ahead. The set itself was arranged in the typical format for such programs. The main host sat in the center position, flanked by 3 other panel members. The seating was comfortable, the lighting was flattering, and everything was designed to make guests feel at ease. The audience was settled in, many of them familiar faces who regularly attended recordings. They had come hoping to hear interesting conversation and get a glimpse of someone they admired. As the guest settled into his chair, he greeted the panelists with genuine warmth. His smile was the one people had come to know over 5 decades, sincere and engaging. He seemed relaxed, confident in the knowledge that he had done interviews countless times before. What could possibly go wrong on a friendly daytime show? The answer came almost immediately. The host began speaking, and from the very first words, something felt different. There was an edge to her tone that didn't match the supposed friendly nature of the show. Rather than welcoming her guest, she launched into a question that seemed designed to provoke rather than engage. She questioned why someone his age was still performing, suggesting that perhaps the time had come to step aside and allow younger talent to take center stage. The question hung in the air like a challenge rather than a conversation starter. The guest handled it with practiced grace. He explained that as long as audiences wanted to hear him perform and he was physically able to do so, he saw no reason to retire. He spoke about how music didn't have an expiry date, and that age was simply a number. It was a diplomatic answer, delivered smoothly by someone experienced in media appearances. Most hosts would have moved on to more positive territory at this point. But the host wasn't finished. She pressed further, becoming more confrontational. She dismissed his recent work, claiming his albums were commercial failures. She pointed out that modern charts were dominated by artists who weren't even born when his career began. The implication was clear. He was irrelevant, out of touch, clinging to past glories that weren't even that impressive to begin with. The energy in the studio shifted. One of the other panelists looked visibly uncomfortable and tried to redirect the conversation towards something more positive, complimenting the guest's maintained vocal abilities and passion. The host cut off this attempt at civility. She doubled down on her criticism, suggesting that the guest's career was driven by ego rather than genuine artistry. She raised her voice slightly, making it clear she wasn't interested in polite conversation. The other panelists exchanged concerned glances. The audience began to murmur, sensing that something unusual was happening. This wasn't the tone of a friendly chat. This was an attack. The guest remained composed. He disagreed respectfully with the host's characterization of his recent work. He pointed out that his fans, many of whom had supported him for 50 years, still attended his concerts and purchased his music. He questioned what commercial disasters the host was referring to, implying that perhaps her information was incorrect. It was a measured response from someone determined not to lose his temper, despite the provocation. The host laughed, but there was no humor in it. She accused him of living in the past, of desperately trying to recapture glory days that weren't particularly glorious to begin with. She challenged him about how he saw himself when looking in the mirror, as a relevant artist or as an old man chasing shadows. The words were deliberately hurtful, designed to wound rather than to engage in meaningful debate. One of the other panelists finally spoke up, unable to remain silent. She defended the guest, pointing out that he was a legendary figure who had brought joy to millions across different generations. She suggested the host was being unfair and unprofessional, The host turned her venom toward this colleague, dismissing the idea that age automatically conferred legend status. She suggested that half the viewing audience probably didn't even know who the guest was, which was demonstrably untrue, but spoken with conviction designed to sting. The guest's composure began to show the first real cracks. Not through anger, but through genuine shock at the treatment he was receiving. In all his years of television appearances, he had never experienced anything like this. He pointed out that he had never been spoken to in such a hostile manner. He asked what he had done to deserve such treatment. The host's response was to frame her cruelty as honest journalism. She suggested that the guest was simply unaccustomed to being challenged because people usually fawned over him. This framing, presenting bullying as boldness, was a tactic designed to justify her behavior and put the guest on the defensive. Another panelist tried to steer things back to safer ground, suggesting they talk about tour dates that viewers would be interested in hearing about. But the host had momentum now, seemingly energized by the guest's obvious distress. She spoke about how performers like him occupied space that could be used by new talent. She suggested he should gracefully exit the industry and let fresh voices be heard. Each word was calculated to demean and diminish. The guest, who had entertained millions and brought joy through music for decades, sat looking genuinely hurt. The famous composure that had served him well throughout his career seemed to be wavering. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. He expressed a belief that every artist deserved basic respect regardless of their age or career stage. He stated that he had never tried to block opportunities for younger performers or interfere with their paths to success. One of the other panelists attempted to change the subject entirely, suggesting they discuss the guest's extensive charitable work. She pointed out that he had raised millions for various causes over the years. This was meant to highlight the positive impact he had made beyond his music career. The host seized on even this attempt at redemption. She attacked the guest's charitable work, framing it as another strategy to stay relevant. She suggested that his public generosity was nothing more than a publicity stunt, a way to keep his name in newspapers when his music career was failing to do the job. This comment proved to be the turning point. The studio audience, which had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, could no longer remain passive. The atmosphere erupted. What had been uncomfortable murmuring transformed into audible gasps and shocked exclamations. Someone in the audience actually shouted that what the host had said was disgusting. The guest's face flushed red for the first time, his famous composure completely shattered. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice shaking with a combination of hurt and disbelief. He questioned whether the host was seriously suggesting that his work helping sick children and supporting various causes was merely a publicity stunt. He pointed out how offensive such an accusation was. The anger in his voice was justified. His charitable work was well documented and genuine, something he had dedicated significant time and resources to over many years. The panelist who had tried to defend him earlier spoke up again, her voice filled with fury. She told the host she had gone too far. She pointed out that the guest had genuinely helped countless people and suggested the host had no right to question his motives for giving back. The host refused to back down. She asserted her authority over the show, suggesting that she had the right to question whatever she wished. She doubled down on her position, refusing to show any contrition or willingness to dial back her aggression. Another panelist, usually calm and measured, found her voice rising. She pointed out that what the host was doing wasn't asking tough questions. It was simply cruelty. She called the host's behavior vile and expressed that the guest had come in good faith only to be attacked. The host turned on this colleague, telling her not to presume to tell her how to do her job. She used derogatory language, referring to the guest and others like him in dismissive terms. The words she used landed like a physical blow. The guest actually recoiled in his chair, his mouth opening in shock. For a moment, he seemed unable to find words to respond. One of the panelists stood up from her chair, something that virtually never happened during a live broadcast. Her voice shook with anger as she told the host she could not continue to sit there and watch this humiliation unfold. She apologized to the guest on behalf of the show and the network, expressing deep regret for how he was being treated. The host commanded her to sit down, making it clear she would not tolerate this challenge to her authority. She doubled down on her position, claiming that what real journalists should be doing. The guest, finally finding his voice again, spoke with steel in his words for the first time. He pointed out that real journalists do ask probing questions, but they don't attack people on a personal level. They don't mock charitable work. They don't attempt to destroy someone's dignity for entertainment purposes. The audience began to applaud. It started with just a few people, but quickly grew until nearly the entire studio was clapping. The sound seemed to infuriate the host even more. She accused the guest of playing the victim, of exploiting the situation for sympathy from the daytime audience. At that moment, the guest stood up. The 73-year-old rose from his chair with quiet dignity, his face expressing profound disappointment. The entire studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but filled with emotion. He said he had been in the entertainment business for more than 50 years. He had been interviewed by some of the toughest and most respected journalists in the world. He had faced difficult questions about his career, his personal life, and everything in between. But he stated, with conviction, that he had never experienced such unprofessional cruelty as what he was enduring in that moment. The host tried to interrupt, but the guest held up his hand and continued. He outlined everything she had questioned: his relevance, his age, his music, and emphasized that, worst of all, she had suggested his charitable work was nothing more than a publicity stunt. He pointed out that she had shown contempt not just for him, but for the millions of fans who had supported him throughout his career. The other panelists sat transfixed by his words. One had tears in her eyes. Another was nodding vigorously in agreement. The third remained standing, her arms crossed in defiance of the host's earlier command to sit down. The guest continued, explaining why he had come to the show. He wanted to share his joy about returning to the stage. He wanted to discuss an upcoming tour that thousands of people were excited about. He wanted to connect with viewers who might enjoy hearing stories from his career. Instead, he found himself having to defend not just his music, but his right to exist as an artist. The host tried to interrupt again, asking if he was finished with his speech, but her voice had lost much of its earlier venom. The audience reaction was clearly affecting her, shaking her confidence. The guest looked directly into her eyes and continued. He expressed sadness about the situation, but not sadness about the personal attacks. Those, he suggested, he could survive. What truly saddened him was the message being sent to young artists who might be watching. The implication that this was how people in the industry treated each other, that cruelty was acceptable and normal. The audience erupted in applause once more, even louder than before. Some people stood up and cheered. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide what to do, whether to cut to a commercial break or continue broadcasting this unprecedented moment. The host's face grew redder. She made another attempt to regain control, suggesting that if the guest was so upset about being challenged, perhaps he should stick to performing for his fan clubs where everyone told him how wonderful he was. The guest responded with sadness in his voice. He pointed out that what she had just said perfectly demonstrated her contempt, not just for him, but for everyone who enjoyed his music. She wasn't just attacking him, he explained. She was attacking every person who had ever found joy in a song he had sung. She was dismissing their feelings, their memories, their experiences as worthless. At this point, one of the other panelists could no longer contain herself. She turned to face the cameras directly and addressed the viewing audience at home. She stated clearly that this did not represent the values of the show or the panel. She defended the guest as a gentleman and a legend who deserved far better treatment. The host tried to say the panelist was out of line, but her authority was crumbling by the minute. Another panelist also turned to the camera and agreed. She called the situation disgraceful and expressed shame at being associated with it. The guest looked at the three women who had tried to defend him, and his expression softened. He thanked them, acknowledging that their kindness meant more than they probably realized. But he said it was clear he was no longer welcome on this show. He began to remove his microphone with deliberate, dignified movements. The simple act of preparing to leave seemed to electrify the entire studio. The audience was on the edge of their seats, sensing they were witnessing something truly unprecedented in television history. The host called out one final attempt to stop him, asking if he was running away. She suggested she thought he was tougher than this. The guest paused, the microphone halfway off. He looked at the host with something approaching pity in his expression. He repeated her question slowly, his voice heavy with disappointment. He explained that he had survived 5 decades in an industry that could be brutal. He had weathered personal attacks, professional setbacks, and public scrutiny that would break most people. But, he said, he had never confused cruelty with strength, and he had never mistaken bullying for toughness. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Every person in that room knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a masterclass in dignity under fire. The guest continued, explaining what real toughness meant to him. It meant treating people with respect, even when you disagreed with them. Real strength, he said, was about lifting others up, not tearing them down. What the host had done today wasn't tough. It was simply sad. The host's face went pale, then flushed red again. The audience's reaction was clearly unsettling her more than she wanted to admit. She tried to defend herself, telling the guest not to lecture her about strength and suggesting he didn't know anything about her struggles. The guest replied quietly that he was right. He didn't know her struggles, just as she clearly didn't know his. But he would never use someone else's pain as an excuse to inflict pain on others. That, he said, was the difference between them. The cameras captured every emotion flickering across the host's face: anger, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like shame. The other panelists watched in stunned silence as their colleague's mask of professional authority completely fell away. One of the panelists stepped closer to the guest. She asked him not to let this experience taint his view of the show or the network, explaining that this wasn't who they were. The guest responded gently, his natural kindness shining through despite the crisis of the moment. He acknowledged that he understood it wasn't reflective of their values. He praised the 3 panelists for showing him nothing but grace throughout the ordeal. Another panelist was openly crying now. She apologized profusely to the guest, saying he deserved so much better treatment. She included herself in this statement, suggesting they all deserved better. The audience began to murmur again, but this time it wasn't shock or gasps. It was a low rumble of agreement and support for the guest. Someone shouted from the back of the studio that they loved him. The host seemed to realize she was losing the room completely. In what would prove to be a catastrophic mistake, she made one final desperate attempt to regain control. She said that at least when she was forgotten, it would be because she stood for something real, not because she spent her whole career singing lightweight pop songs that meant nothing to anyone. The words hit the studio like an explosion. The audience reaction was immediate and explosive. People weren't just gasping anymore, they were shouting. Several audience members stood up and pointed accusingly at the host. One woman yelled so loudly that her voice echoed through the entire studio. But it was the guest's reaction that truly stunned everyone present. Instead of anger or hurt, his face showed something far more powerful. It displayed profound disappointment, mixed with genuine pity. He spoke softly, but somehow his voice carried over all the chaos in the room. He told the host that he genuinely felt sorry for her. To live with that much bitterness, with that much need to tear down others, it must be exhausting, he suggested. The simplicity of his response, the complete absence of retaliation or anger, seemed to deflate the host entirely. She looked around the studio, taking in the hostile faces in the audience, the disappointed expressions of her colleagues, and the cameras that had captured every moment of what was rapidly becoming her professional self-destruction. One of the panelists stood up and walked over to the guest. She asked if he would accept her personal apology, and the apology of everyone who believed in treating guests with dignity and respect. The guest said of course, acknowledging that her kindness throughout the ordeal had been a bright spot in a very dark moment. The audience erupted in applause for this gesture. The sound was deafening, a clear statement of where their sympathies lay. The host sat alone at the presenter's desk now, isolated and humiliated. The guest looked one more time around the studio, taking in the faces of the audience members, many of whom were still clapping. He raised his hand in a gentle wave, and the applause grew even louder. He spoke directly to the cameras, addressing everyone watching at home. He said they should remember that kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything. He urged them not to let anyone convince them that cruelty is strength, or that tearing others down builds you up. He suggested they could do so much better than what they had just witnessed. With those words, he turned and walked toward the exit. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that shook the studio. The 3 remaining panelists joined in the applause, their faces showing a mixture of admiration for the guest and shame for what their colleague had done. As the guest reached the edge of the set, he paused and looked back one more time. He wasn't looking at the host, but at the audience who had supported him through the ordeal. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of gratitude that brought many people to tears. The host sat frozen at the desk, watching as the man she had tried to humiliate walked away with his dignity not just intact, but somehow enhanced. The camera stayed on her face as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had expected to be the tough interviewer who exposed a faded star. Instead, she had revealed herself to be everything that was wrong with modern media: aggressive, dismissive, and fundamentally lacking in basic human decency. The studio fell into an awkward silence as the guest disappeared from view. The 3 remaining panelists looked at each other, in at the host, then at the audience. Nobody seemed to know what to do next. Finally, one panelist spoke into the deafening quiet, announcing they would take a commercial break. When they returned, they would be discussing the importance of treating each other with respect and dignity. As the cameras cut away and the show went to commercial, the audience continued to buzz with conversation about what they had just witnessed. Many people shook their heads in disbelief. Others openly discussed how disgusted they were with the host's behavior, particularly those final moments before the break. The cameras captured one final image that would be replayed countless times in the days to come. The host sat alone at the presenter's desk, her head in her hands, while the empty chair where the guest had sat stood as a silent monument to dignity in the face of cruelty. A man who had walked into that studio as a beloved entertainer had walked out as something more, a symbol of grace under pressure, of kindness in the face of malice, and a powerful reminder that real strength comes not from tearing others down, but from lifting yourself up by maintaining your integrity and your humanity.